Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to jump right in because today we are tackling a profoundly deep and honestly pretty challenging theological topic. We're drawing directly from D.A. Carson's essay, Sin's Contemporary Significance. And our core premise today is actually simple, but the implications are massive. To really, truly understand the biblical story, the whole concept of salvation, and even human nature itself, we first have to grasp the intrinsic significance of sin. Basically, we can't fully appreciate the cure if we don't understand the disease.
Now, to make this dense framework a bit more digestible, we've broken it down into 5 key chapters: the biblical plotline, offending the Creator, the cosmic dimension, the many faces of sin, and we'll wrap up with transformation and hope.
All right, starting right off with Section 1, the biblical plotline.
We have to establish right out of the gate that in this framework, sin isn't just, a random list of bad behaviors. It is the central, driving narrative conflict of humanity. The sheer scale of it carries the entire biblical plotline. I mean, look at this. It starts right at the beginning with the rebellion in Genesis 3. Then it weaves its way through all the ancient eras, the wilderness, the judges, the exile. It directly collides with the first century through Jesus and the cross, and it stretches literally all the way to the end of time, to its ultimate defeat in Revelation. Sin is the underlying current that holds this entire biblical account together.
D.A. Carson captures this perfectly. He says, sin establishes the plot line of the Bible. Sin constitutes the problem that God resolves. The problem and the solution are entirely linked. The source material argues that it's practically impossible to grasp what the cross actually achieves without first plunging into a deep understanding of what sin really is. If you don't get the conflict, well, the resolution just makes no sense.
Moving right along to Section 2, offending the Creator. Here, we're going to peel back some layers to look at the deepest, intrinsic nature of sin on a vertical axis. See, we usually think of wrongdoing strictly on a horizontal axis, right? Like crimes against other people. The text uses King David in the Old Testament to totally challenge this. David committed some horrific horizontal crimes: the seduction of Bathsheba, the calculated murder of her husband. But when he's finally confronted with what he did, David comes to this shocking realization about the true nature of his actions.
Listen to this profound confession in Psalm 51. He says to God, "Against you, you only, have I sinned." Now, on a human level, that sounds, well, blatantly untrue, right? He obviously sinned against Bathsheba and her husband. But the theology here reveals something much deeper. What makes sin intrinsically heinous, what makes it worthy of divine punishment, is that it's fundamentally a vertical rebellion. It's a direct assault on the living God, against his very being and his rule.
And this brings us to a really fascinating theological tension, highlighted here in Exodus 34. Check this out. God is described as forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Wait, how does that work? How can God completely forgive but also not leave the guilty unpunished? It's a literal divine dilemma. The source material explains that the strange tension is only fully resolved by penal substitution at Calvary, where, by divine design, the punishment for the sin is absorbed by a substitute.
Okay. Shifting gears to Section 3, the cosmic dimension.
The human fall was actually preceded by an even darker angelic rebellion. But before we get into that, we need to clear up a massive misconception known as epistemological dualism. That's a mouthful, but basically it's the false idea that good and evil are two equal eternal forces just battling it out. The biblical text completely rejects this. God did not create Satan as an evil being. Everything God created was good. So the clear inference is that the serpent was created good, but fell at a point prior to human history. And that introduces this vast cosmic dimension to the whole problem.
This sets up a brilliant contrast between human and angelic sin. Human sin is what the text calls organic and generating. Because we procreate, Adam's sin infected the entire human race. But humans are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and are provided with a redeemer. Angelic sin, on the other hand, is non-generating. Angels don't procreate, so their initial sin corrupted only the individual angels who chose to rebel. And crucially, unlike humans, fallen angels aren't made in the image of God. They get no redeemer, they are left entirely without hope.
Which brings us to a pretty heavy reality. The source material is completely uncompromising here. The biblical narrative totally rejects ideas like purgatory or universalism, which is the idea that everyone gets saved eventually. Instead, it portrays hell as an eternal consequence, a conscious destination for unrepentant cosmic and human rebellion. But interestingly, geographically speaking within the narrative, it exists entirely outside the restored universe, banished from the new creation.
Let's pivot now to Section 4, the many faces of sin.
The Bible doesn't rely on just one word to describe this core conflict. It uses a really rich, varied vocabulary. And when we look at it, we see sin as this incredibly multifaceted reality. It's transgression, defying explicit laws. It's idolatry, replacing God. It's missing the mark of a divine standard. It's envisioned as dirt or moral pollution. It's even called spiritual adultery, breaking covenant faithfulness. It acts as a power, as a form of slavery, and as profound foolishness. It's definitely not just a monolithic concept.
Furthermore, while sin absolutely is an individual offense, the text emphasizes that it's also profoundly social and multi-generational. It almost never happens in a vacuum. Look at examples like Achan at the Battle of Ai, or Daniel's accusers. One person's rebellion frequently turns others, often their own families, into completely helpless victims. The actions of one generation carry inescapable consequences for the next.
Which finally brings us to Section 5, Transformation and Hope.
So how does God actively resolve this massive, deeply rooted problem? Well, the resolution is built on some powerful theological steps. Step 1 is anthropology. We have to recognize the universally fallen state, often called total depravity. You have to acknowledge the sheer depth of the disease first. Step 2 is conversion, the supernatural fix to that state. And step 3 is sanctification, the ongoing, everyday process of growing in holiness. Let's zoom in on those last two.
There's a vital distinction we need to make about conversion. In sociology, conversion usually just means swapping your religious label, right? Going from Buddhist to Muslim or Baptist to Catholic. But the biblical theology presented in our source material argues that true conversion is phenomenally different. It is a supernatural transformation. It's literally passing from darkness to light, from death to life. The natural is entirely overtaken by the supernatural.
And that supernatural rebirth, it leads directly into sanctification. I really love how this quote distills it. Sanctification is bound up with putting to death of sin. It is the active, present-day defeat of sin in a believer's life. Drawing from Philippians 3, the text points out that believers aren't perfect yet, obviously, but they actively strain toward it. It's moral and spiritual transformation happening right now, acting as a sneak preview of that ultimate, entirely sin-free new creation that's coming.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from cosmic rebellions to the paradox of divine forgiveness. So I want to leave you with this one final provocative thought to chew on. If sin truly is the central, driving plotline of the entire biblical narrative, how does grasping this framework alter your own understanding of the story's ultimate redemption? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.